Recorded in sinfully sunny Las Vegas, Nevada, Avantpop Bookstore presents Joining us on this episode of Avantpop Bookstore Presents is Katherine Yeske Taylor. Katherine has been a rock and roll journalist since high school. She's continued a successful career over the years, and she just released her latest book, She's a Badass, Women in Rock Shaping Feminism. Join us now, Katherine Yeske Taylor. Welcome, Katherine. Thanks for taking some time.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Well, thanks for sending your book. She's a Badass, Women in Rock Shaping Feminism. We get books sent to the bookstore all the time, and usually they don't fit into our category of we're very specialized in what we do. And but I'm always down to read people's books. I never want to say no. And then when I got yours, I was just beside myself. I was so excited.
Oh, that's great to hear.
Yeah, I mean, you cover
After
some of
working
my
on it for 2 years, you just want people to read it.
you cover some of my favorite female artists. I want to start off though with your history, because that to me was some of the most exciting parts for me as someone who loves journalism and writing about music. Could you just start off with your story?
Yeah, I started off writing for my high school newspaper, as I describe in the introduction to this book. I was 16 years old. I would call up the management companies at various bands in Atlanta and just ask if I could interview them for my high school paper. And when they got done laughing at me, a lot of them would say yes. And this was a time in the late 80s, early 90s where Indigo Girls and Black Crows and bands like that were coming out of Atlanta and getting popular. So they would let me interview them. It was a really amazing way to kind of cut my teeth. And then it was really clear that I should go on to journalism school. So I decided to go to the University of Georgia over in Athens, Georgia, because that scene was also having a moment thanks to REM and B-52s. And so I got to interview, a couple guys in REM when I was quite young also. So it was just a really great way to get started in this business. But as I talk in the introduction, not everybody was so willing to let me in the club. It's kind of funny now because I just think back about how differently I would react to guys coming up and saying things to me like they did when I was a teenager. I would have some of the older male writers in Atlanta kind of corner me at a nightclub and say, do you even write your own articles? Or does the editor write them for you? Things like that.
Yeah.
That I just can't imagine anyone saying to a young man who is striving to get started in a career. And so is in that way, my story is really similar to a lot of the stories that the women I interviewed for this book told me. And I'm glad to see that things are getting better when I talk to women who are starting off in journalism now. And
Well,
seems to be getting better for women in music too, but still, there's
yeah,
progress that
yeah.
needs to be made.
Always, unfortunately. Well, and then back in the 80s and the 90s, to be at that age in high school, getting into a club, most people would think you were a groupie. And I've talked to
Yeah.
some older rock star people that we've had on the podcast that talk about the Hollywood at that time. And there were 16, 17-year-old kids in these 21 and over clubs, and they were groupies. And of course, they were definitely taken advantage of. And so to be a journalist coming in with that's smart and creative and asking about actual music, like I bet you were just blowing minds. Nobody was expect that.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I probably looked about 12 years old. um, And I think that the initial thing that people wanted to do was to pat me on the head. And then when I started asking really in-depth questions, they'd be startled because they just weren't expecting that. But um, I really wasn't like the groupies in that, I viewed this as my job. I mean, even at that age, I was very serious about it. And I wanted to interview people because I respected people who can create songs so much. Like, it's like magic to me. I can't write songs. I really, after all these years, still don't understand how people do this. It's like magic to me. So I took it very seriously. And, it
Well,
was fun, but it was my job.
well, I want to hear about the Black Rose interview back then because they were just coming up there,
Hmm.
and like they were big partiers. It just I love that whole sound they were doing back then. It was that soul rock, and just how'd that interview go for you?
That one went well because it turns out that Rich Robinson went to my high school.
Oh, nice.
And so we kind of had a little bonding moment at the beginning where, I said, I'm from Atlanta like you. And they said, what part? And I said, Sandy Springs. And then Rich said, where'd you go to high school? And then he started asking me if we'd had some of the same teachers. And it was kind of a weird moment, but it was cool because, that's not the usual kind of icebreaker
Yeah.
that I get to use. In fact, I'm going to be talking to them again next week
Oh,
for the
nice.
first time since then. And so I plan to use
Wow.
the exact same icebreaker. um, but yeah, I think that, yeah, they were cool to me. And so were Indigo Girls, who, I've interviewed several times now over the years, just very
Yeah.
nice. And I think sometimes people might have pulled their punches because I was young too, because I was just learning. I probably did ask some really stupid questions, even though I took it seriously. I mean, I
Right.
was a kid. And so I'm
Right.
sure there were kind of moments where they thought, what is she doing? But they gave me a pass because I was so young.
Well, how have you polished your journalist interview skills since then? Because you've been writing and interviewing ever since. So
Yeah, well, I did in fact get a journalism degree. And I'm very proud of that. The
yeah,
University of Georgia has a really good journalism school, one of the best in the country. And so I feel like I got a really good education there. And I do think that it's important to have journalistic training. I mean, not to sound snobby, but I look at people who decide they're going to be bloggers who have had no formal training. And sometimes it shows because
yeah,
they ask questions that are maybe a little unethical, or they haven't quite done their research, it's
yeah.
clear, or
Oh,
these
for
little
sure.
things that make it obvious that they didn't have the kind of formal training that I think is really important in order to be able to do this the right
Absolutely.
way.
Yeah. Now, how are you feeling about where journalism's gone now? I mean, if you're journalists are either hated or we're getting taken over by AI. So
Yeah,
we're getting smashed between two stones
yeah.
there.
People keep telling me about the demise of music journalism specifically. I mean, the big news this week is, Pitchfork um, basically being subsumed.
Yeah,
And, this is not the first time in the 3 decades that I've been doing this that I've seen a pretty major outlet
yeah,
struggle. These things come and go, and I tend to be more optimistic than a lot of my peers because I think as long as there are people who are interested in music, there's always going to want to be people who want to read about those musicians. And
yeah.
I don't think that AI can take over because of the things I was talking about just a minute ago, where there's this human connection that you need in order to really do a great in-depth interview. AI isn't going to ask Rich Robinson about his English teacher. you know,
Right.
it's
Yeah.
just not going to break the ice like that. And little things like that make a really big difference, that bonding. So
I agree. I agree.
I'm optimistic.
Yeah, I am too. I hope more editors see that way too when they're hiring journalists, because I think that they think it's just a cut and dry. At least some that I've seen out there and worked with. Now, you've been doing a lot of these interviews, and I don't want to take up a ton of your time because I'm sure it gets it gets redundant after a while. But is there something that you haven't talked about that you would love to talk about in one of these interviews? Because get asked a lot of the same questions, and I have some of them lined up too. But I want to give you a chance, like think like I've been doing this, and I would love to talk about this.
Well, you know, one thing that I'm surprised no one's pointed out yet, is that these interviews are all basically focused on American artists or artists who live in America. That wasn't really on purpose. When I started off this book, I was opening it up to people from anywhere. You know, I've interviewed artists from all over, and so I asked women from different places, and it just turned out that the women who wanted to do this were 18 of the 20 are American. There's one Australian and one Canadian, but they live in America. Both have lived in America for quite some time. And um, I guess I would just be curious to know more about feminism and the experiences of women in music business outside of America, besides here. I wonder if that's a book that maybe someone else in another country can
Yeah.
do.
Well, I hope you
I
keep
would just
writing
be
these because this
curious.
is great. I mean, we get Chrissy Hines in there and some
Yeah,
folks.
people keep asking me if I'm going to do a follow-up, but I don't think so because when I got to about the 17th, 18th, 19th interview for this, I started hearing the same kinds of stories over
Yeah,
and over again, which tells me that I kind of reached the breadth of the types of stories I was going to get. I mean, there's no way to capture everybody's experience under the sun or every opinion, but I feel like the women in this book are so diverse
yeah,
that I think it did a pretty good job of
yeah.
capturing the range.
I really like too that, I mean, people opened up to you,
Hmm.
from one of my favorites, Lydia Lunch. Just talking about, food and just person
Lydia's
her.
chapter is something else. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she had one of my favorite quotes that was, which I'm sure other people have said this too, but the feminism isn't a word. Was it? So I don't think feminist is a radical enough term for what I
Hmm.
am. I'm a confrontationalist. I mean, I was a big Lydia Lunch fan. I do spoken word and lyrics and all that stuff. And so I always looked up to her. And to me, that was one of the greatest lines I'd ever
Yeah.
heard.
Oh, Lydia,
Um,
she's like one amazing quote after the other. I mean, really.
Yeah, yeah. You also had, I mean, Danita was awesome, but who was it? Tanya. She talked about, which I thought was great because she talked about her family life and how her evolution of music. I had no idea how young she was when Throwing
Yeah,
Muses
Tanya
started.
Donnelly.
That was
Yeah.
fantastic. I was a
Yeah.
huge Throwing Muses fan when they came out, and it blew me away that she was so young. And when she started out with her best friend, sister, stepsister ish type situation, but
Yeah.
how she also talked about, how family came in. It was an important part of what she was doing. And I just thought that was great because, people forget a lot that, you have to juggle more than just your career. And
Hmm.
men don't have that as much, I don't think, and at least not in the
Yeah.
past, as a lot of women have. And I
A
thought
lot
that
of the
was,
women in this book, well, not a lot, but many of the women in this book talk about juggling being a touring musician with motherhood. And most of them, it's not an easy situation, but they've managed. But sometimes the way they manage is because they're successful enough they can afford to bring along a nanny,
yeah,
things that I'm not sure that someone just starting off can afford to do. So it's interesting to hear the different perspectives on that because one of them, I think it was Laura Veers, pointed out, there are a lot of men who are touring musicians who are parents also, but it's still kind of the tradition that they leave their wives and children at home and go out on the road, whereas a mother who wants to tour tends to take the child with her.
yeah.
So it's interesting.
One of my favorite bands right now, and we've been friends, my wife and I've been friends with them for a while, is the Dolly Rots. And Kelly and Lewis bring their kids on the road, actually bring them up on stage to play with them. And we've seen them through that whole process. And I've just fallen so much in love with the way they're handling it right now. I mean, to do that and keep that family unit and then actually involve that into your show, I think is brilliant and super fun for the audience and for them, I think. And so that I love that aspect of it all. Now I'm curious, like I don't know, I don't understand why. I think words get co-opted, like woke and progressive, and they get turned into bad words. But how did feminism? I mean, I even noticed throughout the book that some of the women didn't resonate with the word, or it was scary, or they just didn't like to be called that. And did you
Yeah.
get any insight into that?
Yeah, part of the reason why I wanted to delve really deeply into women's backgrounds, going through their childhoods, is I thought that it was going to be a really good way to show how their opinions on different things evolved. And um, it was interesting to see that the ones who really have a problem with the word feminist, there might have been something in their background that would make them disagree with the way the women's movements have progressed. That maybe they thought they were too radical, or um, just don't reflect their own opinions about things. I want to make sure that people understand, though, that all these women are for equality, getting paid equally for work.
It's
It's
what
not
I
that,
always thought feminism meant. It was
yeah,
equal rights.
yeah, but yes, a lot of them did feel that that word has come to have a negative connotation. So even though they're all for, most of the women in this book seem to be pro-choice. They were talking about what was going on with Roe v. Wade at the time of these interviews. Um, so it's not that they are ultra conservative. They just have a problem with what that label has come to mean, the negative connotation. And it was interesting in contrast with the ones in the book who said, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool feminist. I'm really
Yeah,
proud of taking on that label. But they all had the same end game in mind. They all want the same things. It's just the differing approaches to getting that.
yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I remember when L7 came out and Donita, I thought they were the most hardcore punk rock, like more badass than so many other the punk and grunge scene at that time. Like they were just so cool. And I
Hmm.
and I was surprised that they didn't have the longevity, although they've come back now, thank goodness.
Hmm.
But they were just so ahead of their time. And then you read in the story, and Janita talks about how there was a no, DJs wouldn't play women,
No chicks
no
policy.
chick policy, which is such
Uh,
bullshit because that was at that time we always were trying to find more radio stations that would play it. You'd have to go to this was before, like, I mean, MTV was the only thing happening back in that late 80s and early 90s, and they wouldn't barely get played except for like 120 minutes. And you'd have to go like if you lived in a small town, like hunt out record stores and magazine shops that would actually have these things in there.
yeah,
And
that was a really frustrating part of Danita's chapter when she was telling me that story, because you just start to think, if they had gotten the same airplay as Nirvana and Soundgarden and
yeah,
Alice in Chains and these other bands that were um, at an equal level with them at
yeah,
that time,
definitely.
and then those bands took off, and you think, well, was it because they were getting so much more airplay? Probably. Could L7 have been as big as them if they had continued to keep
Definitely.
pace with that airplay? Probably.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. Nice. Well, I love that you included, was it Bonnie from the Death Valley Girls
Hmm.
too, and had some new stuff in there. That was a nice insight because you didn't just pick. One of my favorite chapters too was Toby from Bikini, and you didn't go just for the top people in bands like
Yeah.
Toby, who was the originator of the Riot Girl term, had
Right.
such a great story to tell, and I was so intrigued by hearing it, and I really felt like I had missed a lot over the years being a Bikini Kill fan, not hearing
Yeah.
Toby's story, and I was really glad to see those type of
Yeah.
stories
People
included.
seem to focus on Kathleen Hanna, but as Toby points out, she's not really considered the leader of the band within the band itself. They
Yeah,
consider themselves all equals. But the singer is usually the one that's focused on. But Toby's story, as you pointed out, is so important because she is the one who coined the phrase "riot girl." She thinks, she can't remember exactly for sure, but it's pretty sure.
yeah,
Um, and she also was in a band with Kurt Cobain before Nirvana, and um, that's not really very well known. And when
no,
it is mentioned, people want to kind of dismiss it, like, oh, she must have just been the girlfriend. But she was an equal with him in that band. And
yeah,
so she talks about how women can get sidelined that way. Where if she had been a man who had been in a band with Kurt Cobain before Nirvana, people probably would have been singing her praises and
yeah.
and really pointing that all the time. But in her case, it's kind of swept under the carpet. So
Well, yeah.
yeah.
During that whole grunge scene, there was other female like Babes in Toyland who were killing
Mm,
it back then too, who were fantastic, and they just kind of get forgotten too. And it's
mm,
really unfortunate because I think a lot of the rocker guys. I mean, I was 1990s when I graduated high school, and we were following the badass Riot Girl girls at the time. We were hanging out with them. They were part of our groups. Like they weren't. We were equal with that, and it seems looking back, a lot of that's forgotten by the people who are not only there but by history itself.
mm-hmm.
And that's really unfortunate because those were some big movements. I really thought the world was going to change back in the early 90s,
Well,
that we were all
I
making a
do
big
think that the
movement.
Riot Girl movement did change things quite a
Oh,
bit.
definitely.
Um, I understand the criticisms leveled at it, that it's very focused on middle class white woman. That's true, it was. So that should change. But I do think that it had a really big impact on music and on society as a whole, because it was really the first time that women were allowed to be publicly very angry about all the um, inequality that we faced on a regular basis. So it was refreshing to hear that. And
And
I think it
politically.
has had a lasting
Oh, for
impact.
sure, for sure. Yeah. And politically, I thought was great, because there was a lot of emotion and voice within that movement that was changing, that sent a massive ripple throughout music and politics. I mean, Donita
Yeah.
did the whole voting aspect. What was that she did?
Rock
Rock
for
the vote.
choice.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rock for choice.
Rock
Also
for,
the, yeah. It's interesting to hear how some women in this book talk about how they were very politically active or activists in some way. I thought Joan Osborne's chapter was really interesting in where she talks about being an activist for Planned Parenthood to the point where it's gotten her permanently banned from kind of a major venue in Houston for
yeah.
speaking her mind about that. And that's the thing that's really something that is interesting as I was talking to these women is it's not just the women who are in the punk bands who are bold. It's some of the women in this book are pretty mainstream, like Ann Wilson of Heart,
Yeah.
or Paula Cole. Their stories are just as daring in their way, and just
Yeah.
as they confronted just as many issues
Oh,
as
for
the
sure.
women who were kind of down in the mosh pit and the punk scene kind of thing. And so that's partly why I wanted such a broad range of women, from mainstream to folk rock to punk rock to Lydia's impossible to find rock. But it really shows that all women across the spectrum have confronted a lot of the same situations over the years.
Yeah, definitely. Now, who are some of the female lead singers or bands that you're listening to? You got any recommendations for us?
The ones that I recommend, I tried to put in this book. I really feel more people need to know about Death Valley Girls. I feel
Yeah.
like more people need to know about LA Witch. I feel like more people need to know about Orianthi. There's some artists that I really think are great, and they're doing well. Their careers are really starting to take off. But it's kind of me trying to do my part, saying, here's a younger artist that deserves attention too. And in my journalism, because I still write articles all the time, I try to highlight young women whenever I can. But it's interesting because there still isn't equality when it comes to rock. And that's one of the reasons why I chose to focus on rock music specifically in this book, not just music in general, because out of all the genres, I feel like rock music is still lagging behind in a way that others aren't. I mean, even hip hop, you hear
A
more
huge
female artists.
explosion right now.
Yeah, even country music. I interview a lot of country music artists, and if you turn on a country music station, it really is about half female, half male voices you hear on that
Yeah.
station. It's not the case for rock music still, and so that's why I wanted to address that in this book. And I guess my personal theory about why that is because rock music has always been so testosterone driven.
Right.
And so I wonder if maybe that's kind of at the root of why it's so stubbornly staying off kilter in this way.
Well, first rock music I was listening to was Blondie and Pat Benatar, so they've always been there as far as I'm concerned. Has anybody ever confronted some of these old DJs and said, "Hey, what was your thinking, and have you changed?" Like, are they still like that? I mean, if times have changed, are these guys who are still doing the DJ and that had the no women list and only played one a week or whatever, or have
Yeah.
they ever been confronted and been like, "Why were you and why are you? Have you changed?"
Not that I've ever heard of.
Yeah,
And back in the day, as Tanya makes it clear in her chapter, and I remember this from when I was interning at record companies in the early 90s, that was just the way it was. And you could scream all you wanted about it, and no one was going to care.
yeah,
Um, she talks about arguing with her manager and getting absolutely nowhere with
yeah.
it because that was just the way the system worked and it just wasn't going to change, at least not then. Um, if you listen to rock stations now, it's still the case that it's about, I would say, three-quarters male singers that you
Oh, for
hear.
sure. For sure.
But I'm not sure if that's so much a no chick policy type thing coming into play as it is. Back in the day, there just wasn't as much female-fronted music that got popular enough to be on the classic rock stations now.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking some time. My few recommendations, I'm sure you already know, but female singer bands that I just love. The Dolly Rots, as I mentioned, Kelly is
Mhm.
phenomenal, and I love her writing style. It's super fun. It's got women focus, and I know Lewis writes some of the songs too, and he still has very powerful women's songs that he writes.
Mm.
And then I don't know if you know, you probably do. Back east is Surfboard, Danny of Surfboard, super fun, grungy style, punk pop stuff that's really good. And then here in Las Vegas, we have a band called Crimson Riot, husband and wife too, but Roxy's the lead singer, and super fun, great lyrics, great music, and check all of them out if you haven't already.
That's cool. I'm glad to hear that there's a lot out there that people are finding to like.
Heck yeah.
It's great.
I can't wait. It's so nice to meet you and
Nice
know
to meet
that you're
you.
out there and kicking ass and doing what you're doing, because I was just stoked with your book. It's so good, and the
Oh, thank
interviews,
you.
your writing style and all of it, it's really good. And
Well,
I'll
and it
be
means a lot to have a male interviewer interested too. Like I would say about half and half. It's good. I was kind of wondering if maybe I would get only women wanting to talk to me about this book, but so far it is about half and half, and that's great. And I do want to make the point that this book is not a male bashing book by any means.
not at
It's not a
all.
bunch of women sitting there griping about bad treatment they received. All of them made a point also to point out men who helped them. So
Yeah,
it's not a
yeah.
bitter, angry book by any means. They point out instances where they were angry and bitter in their lives and in their careers. But it's, I
Well,
think, overall, hopefully a positive message about both women and men
yeah.
um,
Well, and I
in
think
the
that's
music
what
business.
feminism is it's just showing the difference that has occurred, and that it needs to be an equal plane, and let's raise those voices up. And I
Yeah.
and I think that's why feminism's not a bad word. It's a word that we should use with pride. Um, Katherine, I appreciate you. I'm gonna go ahead and let you go. Thank you so much for taking this time. I know it's late out there, so thanks for staying up and doing this with us. Okay.
Totally my pleasure. Thank
Right
you. And I
on. If you're
appreciate you
out in
reading my book.
Vegas, yes, come to Vegas. We'll be carrying your book at the bookstore, and come sign some copies for us when you're around. Okay.
Cool. Thank
All
you.
right. Thanks, Catherine. Appreciate you.
Bye.
I want to thank Katherine Yeske Taylor for joining us on Avantpop Bookstore Presents this episode. Her book, She's a Badass, is available at bookshop.org/shop/avantpop. The theme music for Avantpop Bookstore Presents is performed by artist Dillashu. And I hope you can join us again for another edition of Avantpop Bookstore Presents.